Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker. I'm joined by Ash Sarker. Moments before we went live, you were telling me your Angela Rayner take, so you've got 30 seconds.
Oh, my Angela Rayner take. Well, my first take is that it's quite extraordinary that you had the housing minister and the homelessness minister both have to resign because of their own housing arrangements. One is a tragedy, two begins to look like carelessness. But I think the central question of whether or not she deliberately tried to fiddle the stamp duty, I think that she was derelict in her duty. And for me, the more important point is, do you want deputy prime ministers and housing ministers to be held to higher standards when it comes to, being by the book and following all the rules? And for me, the answer is yes, because you're creating the rules for other people. You're literally in charge of the stamp duty regime. And if you find the rules too difficult for yourself to live by, then maybe that should give you a little insight into what the legislation you create means for other people.
Yeah. Me and Aaron were sort of debating it because I was a bit more, I think she should have resigned, but I was a bit more sympathetic, whereas Aaron was calling it sleaze. And that it was one of the good me and Aaron debates where the comments underneath the video were pretty much 50-50 split, which is exactly how I like to see it. I feel like that makes it seem like we're doing something right. We will be talking about Angela Rayner's potential replacements later on in the show. Also, a bit more from Reform UK's conference. They are as cranky as the people around Donald Trump, I think. That's what this weekend has proved to me. If you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support as ever. Make sure to let us know your comments in the YouTube chat, or you can tweet us on the hashtag Novara Live. Around 1,500 people peacefully broke Britain's anti-terror law in Parliament Square on Saturday. As Big Ben struck 1 o'clock above Parliament, a vast crowd gathered in front of it on Parliament Square to write their illegal signs, armed only with the message, "I oppose genocide, I support Palestine Action." The protesters peacefully sat on the grass or under the statues the state has erected to other figures it previously called terrorists, Mahatma Gandhi and Nelson Mandela. Now, each one of those 1,500 people had, at that time, committed an offence under the Terrorism Act 2000 by publicly expressing support for a prescribed organisation, Palestine Action. Now, it was so far the largest protest yet against the prescription of Palestine Action as a terrorist group by previous Home Secretary Yvette Cooper in early July, organised by campaign group Defend Our Juries. It was also one of the largest single acts of mass civil disobedience in British history. So how did the state respond? Well, in the run-up to the protest, the Metropolitan Police had promised that anyone breaking the law would be arrested, saying they had the resources to do so. But that doesn't seem to have been the case. So in total, just 857 protesters were arrested. So a little more than half of those who broke the law. And that's despite the fact that many were elderly, some were disabled, and none resisted arrest. It took hours to complete the arrest, with police officers continuing to take people into custody long into the night. The aim of the mass law-breaking, besides highlighting Israel's ongoing genocide in Gaza, was to show new Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood that the Palestine Action ban is unenforceable. And given that a lot of protesters seem to have been allowed to simply go home after the police made very few arrests over several hours, that point may have been made. The protesters also made it difficult for the police at other points in the process. First, they refused street bail by withholding their details, meaning they had to be taken to custody suites while their identities were ascertained before they could be released. And second, many of those arrested on Saturday, like 62-year-old blind wheelchair user Mike Higgins, were repeat offenders, having been bailed after arrests at previous anti-prescription protests. Now, that means they were potentially in breach of earlier bail conditions, making it difficult for police to simply bail them a second time, rather than taking them into custody for a longer period. Novara Media's Stephen Methan was at Saturday's protest, where he spoke to some of those taking part. One of them was Fiona Godley, a former doctor, as well as the first woman editor of the British Medical Journal, a post she held for 16 years.
Fiona Godley, you're a former doctor, former editor of the British Medical Journal. You're surrounded by other medical workers who are here to protest the prescription of Palestine Action. What has brought you out? What brings them out to risk arrest under the Terrorism Act today?
Well, I've never been arrested before, and I've been driven to this, I think, as all of the people here have, by the terrible scenes we're witnessing on our televisions and the clear evidence that genocide is happening due to the actions of the Israeli government. So beyond that, there is also the actions of our government, UK government, in actively supporting Israel through the sale of arms, but also in refusing to acknowledge that there is a genocide, and then making this proscription of Palestine Action, which is not a terrorist organisation. It hasn't threatened violence against civilian populations. And I've always slightly, been a bit scared of the idea of arrest. So I don't know what has shifted. And I think what has shifted is the government's behaviour. The genocide is an appalling thing, and we absolutely have to act and speak up. But there's something about the way this government is responding, which is unacceptable. And I think there is an upswell of real anger about that and disbelief, really, that we have reached this point.
Do you know anything to say before you go?
I just say that I'm very proud to be here with all these people. And, I think the government has made a big mistake.
Fiona wasn't the only former medical worker present at the protest. A block of doctors, nurses and other NHS workers, some of them retired, others still employed in the NHS, protested together in blue scrubs. At least 14 of them were arrested. One of them was retired Dr. Anne.
There was a man called Pastor Niemeyer, and I don't remember exactly when he was. And I can't quote his words exactly, but what they near enough were, if they come for my friends and I do not stand up, then when they come for me, who will stand up for me? And that's one reason to be here. The other reason is that I thought, yes, I want to go on that protest. And my first response to myself was fear. And I thought, what have they done? I have been going on peaceful protests for 60 years, and that is the first time I have felt afraid. And then I stopped being afraid and got bloody furious. And I just knew that it was necessary.
Now, it wasn't long after that interview that Anne was arrested. Given her age, she elected to walk rather than be carried away. But as you can see in the footage, there were about 6 officers waiting to escort her out of the square. And before she left, she told Stephen, "Good luck, and I'll see you next time." As Anne was being processed, someone caught the police doing some sophisticated operational planning on camera.
Tom, are you happy you're ready to go?
Yeah, we've just been briefing over that last one. We're going to go someone young.
It's all up on me.
Oh, that's nice, isn't it? Get them while they're young. Stop them having careers. What a joy. What a gem you are to society. Really doing a fantastic job. Well done, chaps.
I assume they weren't going for someone young because they wanted to ruin their career, but because they were incredibly embarrassed for having arrested such a, well, I don't want to say such an old woman. I mean, she was a woman of older age. I found very inspirational. Saturday was also new Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood's first full day on the job. Stephen asked Air Force veteran Steve Masters if he had any advice for her.
This is an opportunity today, in your first day in the job, that you can draw a line. You can say, look, we're listening to what people are saying, we're taking advice, and we're going to look to reverse the decision. Don't wait for the judicial review. Get out there and accept that it was the wrong decision. There are active terrorist groups. I kind of, in a moment of kind of, gallows humour, I often wonder whether Yvette Cooper was so naive and stupid that she prescribed the wrong PA, and it should have been, patriotic alternative that were prescribed. So, maybe they can use that excuse.
Patriotic Alternative were described in 2023 by The Times as Britain's largest far-right white supremacist movement. So potentially not bad advice there. You may have noticed that Steve appeared to have some mobility issues there. Now, despite that, as well as the 4 service medals pinned to his chest, he was arrested a few hours later, picked up out of his chair and carried away. Now, we've put out quite a few more of those interviews on social media, but one of the most shocking has been viewed well over 1 million times. Carolyn Gelenter is the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. Here's what happened as she was telling Stephen about her father's experience escaping Nazi-occupied Poland.
I don't know what happened to my grandmother, possibly murdered in the gas chambers of Majdanek. My grandfather was dead already. And they managed to join up with the Jewish unit of the Polish Free Army. And then he came over here for training to Britain because there was so much anti-Semitism in the Polish army, I think there were big protests by the Jewish unit, and somehow my father ended up in the British Army and then went back as a paratrooper to France and Germany in 42 and 43. So that's all I know about him, really.
Pretty amazing story.
No, they are amazing story. I almost feel like my generation, the baby boomer generation, had a collective unconscious to create a situation
I'm sorry, I'm just under arrest
in which we could somehow be heroic. I'm the daughter of a Holocaust survivor.
What's your bag? Where's your stuff? I'll get the officers to get the stuff. If you walk out of us, we'll get everyone taken. You don't have to say anything, ma'am. The question. I'll go through seconds back. Shame on you! 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 Ready, Grace, live! Shame on you! Shame on you! Shame on you!
Actually express my democratic...
So you can see there, Stephen Meffen's interview was rudely cut mid-flow by those police officers. But don't worry, because we got Carolyn Gelenter back on the show. I spoke to her earlier today, fresh from her arrest, and I began by asking her what happened after that event you just saw there.
I was completely surrounded and separated from my rucksack. And so I said, I think it's on the clip where I said, my bag, I need my bag. And the policeman said, I'll get it for you, don't worry. And he didn't. And so I was stuck in a police cell without glasses and a book, which they gave me a book I couldn't read because I had glasses on. But actually, when we were 3/4 of the way there, I suddenly realised I didn't have my house keys. So that was not great, but I managed through various means to get into my flat. But so what happened was they took us into a van just beside Parliament, and then I was only there for about 5 minutes. There was another elderly woman, as in more elderly than me, who was also brought into the van. There were just two kind of cages at the back. And that was interesting in itself, actually. Have you ever been in the back of a police van? They don't have seatbelts. So kind of all the contradictions of it. Anyway, so we went round to kind of Millbank, and then I kept saying, I don't want to be taken to a mobile police setup. I want to go to a police station. I'm not going to give you my name or anything. So they kept asking me for my name, and I just kept saying, I'm not giving it to you. And then we get out at the back of Millbank, and there were all these sort of gazebos for about, I don't know, hundreds of yards with hundreds of police or tens of police sitting in the gazebo ready for the crowd they were going to arrest. And at each point where we stopped, they kept asking me what we should, give us your name and then you can go home. And I said, no, I want to go to a police station and be arrested. I don't want to give you my name. And I have to say, everybody was extremely polite. I can't help myself. I'm an eternal optimist, so I was cracking jokes and then when we got, we kind of were sat at the end of where all the gazebos were, and then pretty quickly, actually, 2 other arrestees were brought over. And so there were 3 police officers for the 3 of us, and they put us in a van where they waited for about, I don't know, half an hour to get instructions about where they should take us. And then we ended up in Plumstead. And the last time, Plumstead Police Station, the last time I'd been to Plumstead was in the early 90s on a protest against the National Front. And that's the only thing I remembered about Plumstead, that it was a big national BNP area. And actually, I found out that they had opened the, I don't know, what do you call the custody station at the back? Especially, it was closed, and that all the police were talking about how it wasn't fit for purpose, and they'd only opened it up because they had nowhere else to take us. So that's where I ended up.
You're the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. That's what you were telling my colleague Stephen about when you were arrested. And you had it on your sign. And I suppose I wanted you to explain why you thought it was important to have that on your sign, to say this daughter of a Holocaust survivor. What did the sign say? Opposes genocide and supports Palestine Action.
I did and ah about that because, of course, when I went on the call out for the Defend Our Juries, we were told not to, if possible, not to have other messages, just to stick with the message. But I think, I think, as I said in one of the interviews I've done, like when people think about, when my kind of everyday friends at work who say aren't active think about Jews, they think about Israel, and they think, that everybody has a kind of a view that Israel represents me. And actually, I've had people say, "Oh, aren't you Israeli?" And so I really feel there's a growing and significant minority of Jewish people who do not want anything to do with Zionism. And I know I think there is a rise in real anti-Semitism. And so I felt it was really important not just to identify as a Jew, but to say, these arrests in a way are being done in my name because, Palestine Action is a terrorist group that's, nobody's called them anti-Semitic, but that's sort of the implication because they're targeting Israeli arms manufacturers, amongst other things. And so, I felt it was really important to say, look, actually, this is not in my name. And I really support, I'm very concerned about what's going on in our country, in Britain. I mean, as you can hear, I'm Australian, but I have dual nationality and I've lived here over half my life. And I, because of my history, and I've read a lot about the Holocaust and fascism, I felt it was really important to identify as a Jew. Somebody who was standing around, another person who stands under the banner, the survivors and descendants of Holocaust against genocide, said to me, when the police arrested you, you were holding your line. So I actually wasn't holding a placard saying I oppose genocide and I support Palestine Action. So I've written to Defend Our Juries to see whether my arrest can be challenged on that ground, because I wasn't actually holding that sign when they came to arrest me.
And that was Carolyn Gelenter, who I really enjoyed speaking to earlier today. And the protest in Parliament Square seems to have been pretty calm throughout, or for the most part, let's say, with those carrying signs practicing only peaceful, passive resistance to their arrests, going floppy, as it's called. But the Metropolitan Police, followed by some of the media, had a very different story to tell. So just before 6 p.m. on Saturday, the Met posted this. Officers policing the Defend Our Juries protest in Parliament Square have been subjected to an exceptional level of abuse, including punches, kicks, spitting and objects being thrown, in addition to verbal abuse. Any assaults against officers will not be tolerated and arrests have already been made. We will identify all those responsible and prosecute to the full extent of the law. Now, that update could be naturally understood as saying that police officers were subject to abuse from those breaking the law to support Palestine Action. In other words, the peaceful sign holders that we've just shown you were, in fact, one would be led to believe by reading that tweet from the Met Police, a violent mob. And some of the media helped to amplify that impression. So the Sunday Times reported that nearly 900 people were arrested after Palestine Action supporters clashed with police. And the image they've chosen suggests a pretty tumultuous protest. The Independent had a similar headline suggesting that violent clashes erupted during mass arrests at the protest in Parliament Square. Again, that seems at odds with the nature of the protest that you saw in the footage from our reporters. So what happened? Well, as this footage, shot at 6:40 p.m. shows, there were more than just the seated law-breaking protesters in Parliament Square at that time, with the police also barricading more recently arrived crowds. out of the square. And it's at those borders, not amongst the sign holders, that Stephen Meffin says he saw a few confrontations. And it's important to get this right, and not just because the truth's important. It's also because associating Palestine Action with violence in the public imagination has been a central part of Yvette Cooper's strategy for winning over public opinion ahead of a judicial review of her decision to proscribe the group in late November. Here's how Cooper spoke about Palestine Action last month.
It's based on violent action and injuries that this group has taken, including on national security targets, but also injuries to people, and also some disturbing information referring to future planning as well. So that's the information that I have to take immensely seriously when making those prescribing decisions. I do understand there will be people who do not know, who are wanting to protest, who do not know what the nature of this group is. Let's be clear, this is not about Palestine or protesting about Palestine. This is about a particular narrow, specific group that has both a violent record and information and about future planning as well.
They have a record of shutting down arms factories, which is why now that they've been prescribed, there are hundreds and hundreds of people from all walks of life who are willing to put their freedom on the line to oppose the ban. There's also some evidence showing from the weekend the police losing their cool. Paula Dodds of the Metropolitan Police Federation has described officers policing the Palestine Action protests as emotionally and physically exhausted. She also appeared on The World at 1 today, where she said policing these protests was unsustainable.
Peaceful protests, we deal with protests every week in London. When we know that this particular group are coming out to be arrested because they want us to block up the system, they want to show that we as a organisation don't have the capacity to deal with it, but we do. But what that means is that my officers, the officers that I'm here to represent and talk about, end up working 20 hours a day. There were some officers at the weekend working over 20 hours. And that's not sustainable.
Okay. So just to get to the bottom, is it just pressure from the amount of work, or is it the type of work as well? It's
both. It's the pressure and the type, because don't forget, all these officers have still got day jobs outside of police and protests. So when they go back to work the following day, with few hours in between, they've still got to then police the areas of London and keep the communities of London safe.
So ultimately, do you want the government to change the law? Is that what you're saying?
We will always facilitate peaceful protests, whether or not we can or we. I think the difficulty with protests is that when there's sustained protests, Palestine Action Group coming out every week, we will have to police that every week. If they weren't, there are some protests that we don't police at all because of the numbers, and they don't have an impact on the communities in London and the public. So I think it's a really difficult choice, and what the government can do, I don't know.
Let's go to Ash on this. It seems to me that the police probably are a bit annoyed that they keep having to arrest retirees. I'm sure our audience have very divided opinions on the police, but I don't think many of them did go into the job to arrest women in their 70s and 80s. Like many of them might have had ulterior motives and sinister motives when they joined it, but I don't think many of them were expecting to be doing this in Parliament Square weekend after weekend or month after month, because they seem to be every month at the moment, don't they?
Well, in terms of how the police are feeling about it, just to draw the attention of viewers to an article written by our wonderful colleague, Harriet Williamson, where she managed to talk to some serving police officers about how they felt making these arrests. And they talked about feelings of, I guess, job dissatisfaction, of shame, saying that this isn't why they joined the force. And I think that this speaks to the quite clever strategizing of Defend Our Juries, because when police officers are arresting large numbers of young people, I mean, Michael, you and I have both been part of those protests. We've seen how then they're presented in the media, troublemakers, hotheads, they're violent, or, know nothing students who've got like a devil may care attitude. And of course, there is some element of truth to that. With younger groups of protesters, you do see people who are getting carried away, or they've got a sense that the most radical tactic is the right one, and that's not necessarily going to be the best thing that's going to play with your Middle England persuadable, regardless of the rightness or wrongness of the cause. Whereas Defend Our Juries have said, okay, we're going to ask older people who clearly don't pose a physical threat, who don't have criminal records, who they've not got convictions for like violent disorder in their back pocket, and who make a really strong moral case. And by putting them front and center, you're trying to force a crisis, right? And a crisis of legitimacy for policing. And while I don't necessarily sense that there is an overall crisis of legitimacy yet when it comes to these protests, you do see that it's beginning to have a bit of an impact in terms of the questions that media are asking. So, for instance, that journalist saying, well, is it just the pressure, or is it the type of work that's being done as well? I don't think that would necessarily have been the case had it been, young radical students being arrested. Similarly, there was an interesting thing which came out just a few minutes ago. You have had some MPs who either voted for prescription or abstained on the bill, saying, oh, we weren't made fully aware of all the effects of prescription. Now, personally, I think if you're voting on legislation, maybe you should be fucking aware. I mean, you get paid enough, all right? When your starting salary is 80K, I think you should be able to do your reading homework, all right? But I digress, right? You have to welcome people who change their minds. I don't think that they would be saying that were it not for the kind of ambient political pressure that's created when you've got hundreds of older people, priests and retired GPs being arrested. So I think it's some smart strategizing on the part of Defend Our Juries.
We've obviously got a new Home Secretary now. There had been some speculation that maybe sort of with a change of guard, Shabana Mahmood could come in and say, oh, yeah, a mistake has been made. Maybe we're going to be able to roll this back. I mean, Shabana Mahmood doesn't... She's sort of being talked about as quite right-wing, and that's why Keir Starmer has chosen her. But she was a bit stronger on, well, according to reporting, obviously she's in the shadow, well, she's in the actual cabinet, so she doesn't speak publicly against the government, but reporting had suggested that she was putting pressure when it came to calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. So some people thought maybe this is when the government can do a U-turn. Doesn't seem likely. So she tweeted on Sunday, supporting Palestine and supporting a prescribed terrorist group are not the same thing. An honour to visit Sir Mark and Met Police to see them at work policing protests yesterday. And it sort of, the tweet came with some images of her in the Metropolitan Police headquarters. I suppose that the government's hope, Ash, would be that most of the people who want to get arrested for supporting Palestine Action have already done it. So, there has to be a point at which the size of these protests subside. And at that point, sort of the political danger begins to subside. And that it makes more sense from a political perspective. Obviously, I wholeheartedly disagree with the prescription, but from a political perspective, they might think it makes more sense to cross their fingers and hope this dies down just because of sort of the natural attrition of protesters than to do what would be a very embarrassing U-turn.
Well, look, I think there's some truth in that. But when you consider that in the last, mass act of civil disobedience, you had something like 450 arrests. Now for this round of arrests, it's been more than 900. You haven't reached the point of having to turn the barrel of protesters upside down and shake it to get right, what's right at the bottom. So I think that, next month's planned civil disobedience is obviously going to be indicative of whether Defend Our Juries have been able to find more volunteers or not, which is obviously, I think, going to shape the government's point of view. I just think on Shabana Mahmood, I mean, there was a really interesting bit of anonymous briefing that I read over the weekend, which was, Shabana Mahmood is a Muslim woman. The left won't know what to do with her, which is, I think, speaks to a point that I've been making for ages, which is everybody's doing identity politics. The left does identity politics. The centre does identity politics. The right does identity politics. Because when it's time to hide from actual political contestation, you put race and ethnicity and religion front and centre. Oh, the left won't know what to do with her. I mean, I think that when it comes to, materially impactful policy issues, whether that's the proscription of a non-violent direct action group with all that implies for freedom of speech, or something like making it harder for refugee families to reunite in this country, you could be Muslim, Hindu, black, white, or Barney the dinosaur. Your identity doesn't matter. The substantive policy issue matters. And I think that Shabana Mahmood, while in the past she has spoken out in support of Palestine, I think that she's shown herself to be whoever she feels the moment needs. So she was, I think, quite senior when it came to planning Keir Starmer's election campaign. I think that she sees the job of Labour to appeal to, more right-wing voters. And her personal identity characteristics are neither here nor there.
We've got a super chat from Dean Robertson. 1,000 grannies arrested for protesting genocide. The Palestine Action ban is patently unenforceable. There is simply no way charging hundreds of boomers is feasible. When the law falls, so should Cooper. Looking ahead, let's look at a post from Defend Our Juries. Say they appear already to be arranging their next protest. It says register for action in October, date TBC. We will not be intimidated. And then I don't know if that's a picture of the last protest or the one before. I am most certain we will be discussing this story more in the near future. The Labour Party has announced a tight deadline for the deputy leadership election to replace Angela Rayner. Candidates will have only 2 days to gain a sufficient number of nominations from MPs. Those who go through will then have 2 weeks to gain nominations from CLP, so local parties and trade unions. The candidates remaining will then be put to a vote of the members, with the results announced by the 25th of October. Some on the Labour left have claimed this short schedule amounts to a stitch-up. Richard Bergen said this today at the TUC conference. The reason that the leadership of the Labour Party is trying to rush this process is because they don't want our politics on the ballot paper, and that should concern all of us. They don't want the politics of a wealth tax on the ballot paper. They don't want the politics of a ceasefire in Gaza and sanctions on Israel on the ballot paper. They don't want the politics of an improved package of workers' rights, including trade union rights, on the ballot paper. That's where they're trying to push through this anti-democratic stitch-up. Now, Richard Bergen is, I'm pretty sure, right about the intention of the Labour leadership. They wanted a short campaign so that they could keep out people oppositional to Starmer. In terms of the politics Richard Bergen is talking about, though, it's unclear how much difference extra time would have made. So to get on the ballot, any MP would need the support of 20% of the parliamentary Labour Party, which as it stands means 80 MPs. Remember, they changed all of the rules to try and make sure Corbynism could never happen again. The Socialist Campaign Group, for context, currently only has 21 Labour MPs. So sort of the chances of someone from that group getting on the ballot is essentially nil. So which MPs think they could have a chance of securing that number, which is 80 MPs? Well, Emily Thornberry has messaged MPs saying she wants to stand, and she's been sharing this video of her on the BBC over the weekend.
As we've gone from having the fantastic gift from the British public of a huge majority to now being at 20% in the polls, and we will have in the next election, I think, the biggest fight of our lives coming, which is against Farage. And the last thing we want is to go from a position where it was thought we would be in for 2 terms to hand our country over to Farage.
And we'll have more time to get into this later on, but if you could sum up in a sentence what you think the mistakes represent, what is it?
I think it's not listening. I think it's not listening to people of goodwill who want the party to succeed. I think we need to do more of that, because I think that the answers are out there. But I think that we need to continue to listen and learn from the public.
Now you can see how that's a deputy leadership bid, because MPs always want the leadership to listen to them more. Obviously, she said at the end, the public as well. If Emily Thornberry gets through to the final round, that's the kind of clip she'll want Labour members to be thinking of, to remember. This is one that might dog her, though.
Do you think cutting off food, water and electricity is within international law?
I think that Israel has an absolute right to defend itself against terrorism.
That's not the question I asked.
It is an answer to the question that you've asked, and I think it's an appropriate one at this time.
Now, Emily Thornberry has sort of attempted to sort of speak out a bit more against Israel's genocide. I don't think she calls it a genocide, but to speak out more against, well, what I would call Israel's genocide. I'm not sure what she calls it, but that answer there is never going to escape her. Someone else who seems to want the deputy job is Louise Haigh. She resigned from Starmer's cabinet last November after it was revealed that she had pleaded guilty to fraud by false representation relating to misleading police in 2014. The case related to a work phone Haigh had said had been stolen, but which in fact hadn't been. She said sort of honest mistake, but she did plead guilty in the end. That whole background might mar any attempt to become deputy leader, but Haigh is pursuing a strategy, or seems to be pursuing a strategy, of positioning herself firmly to Starmer's left. So she had an article published today in the New Statesman calling for the government to drop Rachel Reeves's fiscal rules, or at least to modify them. In the piece, she writes this: unless Labour can govern with real fiscal freedom, the public will not feel the change they voted for. At the same time, we cannot continue to be hamstrung by the OBR simply because the Chancellor's headroom has reduced or disappeared. No sensible policymaking is done at 6-month intervals. There would be no point in even considering wealth taxes if the only thing they'd achieve was to placate the OBR for a few months. There is a democratic argument at the heart of this as well. A Labour government with a landslide majority in Parliament cannot and should not be stopped from delivering the change we clearly set out in our manifesto simply because of assumptions made by the OBR. If we let unelected institutions dictate the limit of change, we betray the people and communities who put their trust in us. I think that's a strong argument, really, this idea that everything Rachel Reeves does is to try and get the OBR to upgrade growth forecasts or say that we're not going to be in this much debt in 5 years' time seems ridiculous. Andy Burnham, for his part, is reported to be encouraging Louise Haigh to stand for the job. Other influential Labour figures have been focused on the identity characteristics of potential candidates. So Harriet Harman, former deputy leader, today told the BBC the deputy leader should be both Northern and a woman. The former there would rule out Thornberry. The two conditions would rule in Louise Haigh. Alison McGovern, who is from Merseyside, is also, according to the Times, currently putting herself forward. She is a former chair of Progress, which is the right-wing faction of the Labour Party. Lisa Nandy is apparently also sounding out colleagues, as is Sarah Owen and Annalise Dodds. Annalise Dodds, sort of thought of as quite a soft-left character, resigned from Starmer's government when the cuts to foreign aid came in because she was development minister. I suppose she's someone who might be seen as somewhat independent to Starmer, but would also be supportive of him. Ash, my question for you: who have you got your eyes on? Who have you got your eyes on?
My eyes on.
Your eyes on, and significantly, do you care?
Look, I can't say that this one has been keeping me up at night with excitement. But I think that there are some interesting things to keep an eye on, which is maybe less the deputy leader candidates themselves, but more looking at the balance of power within the party. So who MPs are nominating for the ballot and in what numbers. And also you've got this sort of parliamentary grouping, which has just been launched called Mainstream, which has got, the support of, it's basically a Compass initiative. There's also Clive Lewis, Andy Burnham. This idea of, we want to take Labour back to the mainstream, which I think means a little bit more left wing, like a little bit more, sort of what you consider traditional social democracy. Personally, I don't know how far these initiatives go while you have Keir Starmer as leader of the Labour Party and Prime Minister. You've got individuals like Morgan McSweeney still very powerful, very influential. As you said, this new cabinet does seem to represent a big shift to the right. But in terms of, say, selecting the next leader of the Labour Party, they could hold some sway. An interesting thing also to think about is how engaged are the Labour membership. Of course, Keir Starmer and his allies have recomposed the Labour membership significantly since 2020, when he and Angela Rayner became leader and deputy leader. Lots of people expelled, suspended, snoozed out. There's also moral cases for leaving. And I think that a lot of the people who are still there in the membership, they don't necessarily feel a great groundswell of support for, this iteration of the Labour project either. So I'd be quite interested to look out turnout figures, because I think that will show you what level of engagement and faith in the Labour Party machine exists amongst the membership.
There have been a few more sort of changes to the reshuffle over the weekend since our show on Friday. So I wanted to get some of your thoughts on that. The Minister for Employment Rights, Justin Madders, has been sacked. He was sort of seen as very close to Angela Rayner, one of the main people pushing for the Employment Rights Bill. Jonathan Reynolds, as we found out on Friday, has already been demoted. So the whole team behind the Workers' Rights Bill is gone. When it comes to the Home Office, I think that whole team was kicked out. Shabana Mahmood in, which many people are sort of saying she's going to get tougher. Mike Tapp is now a junior minister in the Home Office. I don't know if you know him. He's the Dover MP who does quite a lot of videos of himself, like out on a boat, sort of talking about how we have to secure our borders. So I suppose most commentary I've read about this is suggesting this is a move to the right from Starmer. I mean, he's sort of strengthening his team in the sense of we are going to be stronger when it comes to law and order, stopping the boats, and actually with McFadden in the DWP, they're going to try and get through some more benefit cuts, but do it in a slightly better organised way this time. What's your impression of the direction the Starmer government might go in with after this reshuffle, I suppose? We're in the reset phase 2, of course.
Well, Michael, I'm in danger of agreeing with you too much. I think that it is going to be a shift to the right on things like borders, immigration, refugees, also welfare as well. So they had to abandon, the proposed cuts to personal independence payments because they would impact the most severely disabled individuals. But we know that this Labour leadership have been eyeing that welfare bill for quite a long time, and all their promised, careers coaches or jobs coaches, people that are supposed to advise you into a job. I don't think that's going to make much of a difference in terms of, the amount of people who can't work because they're signed off sick or disabled. So I think that they're going to be coming back around to the welfare bill in some way, shape or form. But something which might be interesting is, as you mentioned, the Employment Rights Bill. So the individuals who are sort of driving that through have either resigned or been demoted. But how much room for shifting to the right on the Employment Rights Bill does Keir Starmer really have? So you might see some watering down, but I think if they scrapped it completely, it would put their union funding in real trouble. One of the reasons why union leaders have been critical of Keir Starmer, but not necessarily making noises about disaffiliating or removing, support from particular candidates, is because of the Employment Rights Bill. And when you've got a competitor left-wing party, it's still in its sort of embryonic or fetal phase. It hasn't come out of the womb yet, but there will be a left-wing party led by Jeremy Corbyn and Zara Sultana. There will be people within the trade union movement pushing for disaffiliation from Labour and some degree of funding for this new party. So for the first time, yes, Keir Starmer's cabinet picks are indicating a shift to the right, but for the first time, there could be some significant electoral pressure coming from the left. And we haven't seen how Keir Starmer or his cabinet would respond to that yet. It's an unknown. It's a known unknown, but it's still unknown.
Yeah, I mean, that is going to be really interesting once we see this new party sort of begin. If sort of, because Labour could easily go down to like 15 once the Corbyn-Starmer parties come. So if they suddenly start to realise, they do have to fight for their left flank as well. Of course, their obsession is reform, and we're going to move on to Nigel Farage just next. Nigel Farage is very close mates with Donald Trump, and Reform's conference over the weekend proved once again he would bring the worst parts of Trumpism to Britain.
Well, one of Britain's most eminent oncologists, Professor Angeli, said to me to share with you today that he thinks it's highly likely that the COVID vaccines have been a significant factor in the cancer of members of the royal family.
That's a really weird claim. The cancers of the royal family were caused by the COVID vaccine. Now, I should say the supposedly eminent oncologist referenced there by Malhotra just so happens to have stood to be a UKIP MP in 2015. Cancer UK was forced to respond to Malhotra's claim. So they said, there is no good evidence of a link between the COVID-19 vaccine and cancer risk. The vaccine is a safe and effective way to protect against the infection and prevent serious symptoms. Asim Malhotra is a senior advisor to Robert Kennedy Jr., so RFK Jr., who is the vaccine skeptic Trump put in charge of the US Health Agency. Farage is said to have personally secured Malhotra's speaking spot at the Reform Conference because of his closeness to Donald Trump. So we've had MAGA-style anti-vaxxers. But what else was on display at the Reform Conference? Well, Telegraph journalists Alison Pearson and Liam Halligan did a live version of their podcast, Planet Normal, and this was their special guest.
Our Planet Normal guest this week has become a living symbol of two-tier Britain. The sheer injustice she has suffered has shocked millions of people across Britain and indeed across the whole world. She's a wonderful mum, wife, beloved childminder, little kids from every corner of the earth she's taken wonderful care of. So I am, of course, referring to Britain's favourite political prisoner. Ladies and gentlemen, please give the warmest of welcomes to Lucy Connolly.
Now, Lucy Connolly has recently been released from prison after a year inside for sending a tweet, which in the run-up to last year's summer riot. So this was the tweet, obviously after the horrible killing of 3 young girls. So she said, mass deportation now, set fire to all the effing hotels full of the bastards for all I care. While you're at it, take the treacherous government and politicians with them. I feel physically sick knowing what these families will now have to endure. If that makes me racist, so be it. So that was sent sort of just before those riots where asylum hotels were set on fire. She deleted that tweet after about 4 hours, I think. I personally think Lucy Connolly's sentence was out of proportion for her crime, which was to post this disgusting tweet and then delete it 4 hours later. But Ash, whatever your views on that, it does seem worrying to me that the party conference of the party leading in the polls is treating the person who wrote that tweet, set fire to all the effing hotels full of the bastards, is now being treated as a hero. He's getting a sort of hero's welcome, round of applause, like a rock star at Reform's conference.
Well, I just think there are so many parallels that you can draw between the Trump MAGA movement and what Reform is doing. And I also think that perhaps the ineffectiveness of the Democrats' attacks on Trump also give you a little bit of an indication of what works and what doesn't work in terms of being able to effectively combat it. So when it comes to Lucy Connolly, I agree it was a harsh sentence, but the core problem is that she entered a guilty plea for the most serious offence. Now, when you're putting that against a backdrop of widespread violent disorder, the sentence is going to be really, really harsh. Now, I don't, agree with the idea of the police, routinely intervening in people's social media posts. But taking that context and the guilty plea into account, yes, it was a harsh sentence, and I think an unduly harsh sentence. But I don't think that she is herself a victim of a miscarriage of justice. I mean, I think she made some very, very poor choices, including how she chose to deal with what pleas that she entered. What's interesting to me about her as a person is that not just the asylum seekers tweet, but I've seen some other, shall we say, not nice tweets that she posted. Now, of course, I don't think that the police should be knocking down her door. The thing which I think is interesting is what happens when you effectively reward somebody for dysregulated behavior. So for outlandish behavior, offensive behavior, nasty behavior, when you turn them into a kind of celebrity, I don't think that anything good comes of that, whether it's political or whether it's in terms of, the inner political culture of reform or an individual psychology. I think it's a very, very bad thing to turn people with a history of dysregulated behavior into celebrities. But there is a sort of parallel here in terms of trying to find someone who has done something, shocking and horrible, right, and repulsive, and trying to turn them into a bit of a hero for your cause. I mean, this is obviously much, much more extreme. But Kyle Rittenhouse, who you might recall is an American teenager. He was a teenager at the time, who shot and killed somebody at a BLM protest. Now, the court ended up accepting that he acted in self-defense. You can tell what I think about that in terms of the court's findings. But he then became something of a superstar for the American right. And the point was, I think, to revel in the obnoxiousness of it all. Like, here's somebody who, rightly or wrongly took a life, and you're turning him into a celebrity off the back of that. I think part of the idea is to rile people up and to sort of, project a sense of being impervious to conventional morality. And I think that that's a bit of what's going on here with Lucy Connolly. And I guess the last thing that I'd end on is, how effective is it to highlight this? You might remember in 2016, Hillary Clinton calling MAGA supporters a basket of deplorables. And spoiler alert, didn't result in her winning the presidential election. I think that it is a highly limited strategy to point out that a right-wing populist party is, full of Fruit Loops and people that you wouldn't want to hang out with, when there isn't a credible populist alternative. So when you've got someone who is effectively the voice of the establishment, the voice of business as usual, saying, let's condemn these people, the fact is that I think many voters out there feel so let down by the current state of affairs that they can choose not to mind. They can choose not to mind who they're sharing a ballot box with. And so I think that there are some lessons for everybody there.
And Carl Rittenhouse actually killed 2 people. And that was, what was so disgusting about that is whether or not you think it was in self-defense. From looking at the evidence, I don't think it was. But obviously a jury found it was. So, maybe they looked at the more details than me. But he went to a protest with a big gun. It's not a heroic thing to do. Whether or not you think he should have been guilty or not guilty, that's not a heroic thing to do. So treating him like a hero is incredibly dangerous. And I think it's exactly the same with...
I forgot it was more than one person. I mean, I think that's even more sickening. And yeah, I think he drove across state lines, with a high-powered gun and killed 2 people. To turn someone who's killed 2 people into a celebrity for the act of killing 2 people, I think is disgusting.
Obviously, the right would say that the left have done it for Luigi Mangione.
Yeah, but he had great eyebrows.
On the point of where, is this a good thing to attack reform on? Because, it didn't work for Donald Trump. I mean, I think that can be overplayed, because, one of the things that I think did bring him down in 2020 was sort of his incompetence during COVID-19. And obviously he has got into power by allying with RFK Jr. being the anti-vaxxer and stuff, but maybe that did depress his vote a little bit. I don't know. And I feel like it is a risky strategy for Nigel Farage to invite people to his conference who are going to say that the royals got cancer from the COVID vaccine. Like, I'm not saying that will no one can become prime minister while they're allowing people like that to be the voice of their party. But it does seem like if he was, really disciplined in his focus on getting to number 10, you probably would avoid that kind of thing if possible? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this is important for motivating your base, but I don't know. What do you think?
Well, the thing is that by their nature, conferences are base-facing. So it doesn't really have too much of an impact on voters, unless you've got, what happened during the Corbyn years, which is, the entirety of the lobby combing through for scare stories, which are going to run top of the Today programme for a week afterwards, all right? That's maybe when it matters. But ultimately, conferences are base-facing. They're not really for the general public. They're not really for the wider electorate. I think that you make an important point about the possible difference between Trump and Farage, which is Britain and America have different political cultures. So you have, a strain of gun-toting libertarianism, which in this country we don't really have. I think we're more comfortable with the idea of authority in this country. And while there were obviously anti-lockdown and some anti-vax protests, it didn't find a massive political expression. So there wasn't really, war around schools and stuff like that. The same way there were, huge battles over, mask mandates and mandatory vaccines in the States. So I think that the contexts are a bit different. But in terms of you saying, oh, well, maybe it depressed Trump's vote. I mean, just don't forget that in 2024, Trump made gains with basically everybody. So, could he have won, to quote the orange man himself, could he have won more bigly had he not aligned himself with vaccine skeptics? Maybe, but he won pretty big.
Yeah, he won pretty bigly. I suppose on Luigi Mangione, because obviously there were lots of people online were kind of fangirling him. And we obviously on this show commented on his attractiveness whilst not endorsing him having murdered someone. But you still can't imagine actually even like a kind of, say like if the Corbyn Sultana party launches, they would not have him on to speak at a conference. Actually, no, Lucy Connolly didn't kill anyone. The example here is the Americans. The Democrats would not have Louis Mangione on to speak, but the Republicans did have Kyle Rittenhouse on to speak. So there is only, I don't want to do the false equivalence where I say everyone's the same, because it is actually only the right.
I mean, I think that with Luigi Mangione, there is perhaps a shared spirit of trolling, to be honest. And I think that, you held a mirror up to my face, Michael, when you said, well, what about Luigi? And the only thing I could do was try and parry it away with a joke, which is the refuge of someone who knows they're on shaky ground. But I think that, to consider it, there is certainly an element of trolling when you think about the way in which Luigi Mangione in like online circles has been turned into a beloved figure. And I think that while there are differences when violence is also associated with racism and with misogyny and with anti-Semitism and all of these things, I do think that does make a moral difference. But I do think that there is this sense of wanting to hold, two fingers up to expected norms. So in a way, while I don't think of them as being moral equivalents, certainly in terms of, the harm that was done by a CEO of a health insurance company that routinely denied people life-saving healthcare. I think the harm that they did is very, very different from the harm that two protesters were alleged to have done. And so, the Kyle Rittenhouse and Luigi Mangione thing for me is not a moral comparison, or a moral equivalent, shall we say. I think that it's a fair comparison to think about, well, why is it that we have a political culture where individuals who do commit violent acts kind of become something of a meme. The difference is as you said, like Luigi Mangione would never be conveyor belted into respectability in the way that Kyle Rittenhouse was after his acquittal.
Yeah. I mean, the right have done a thing of saying this is normal politics, and while there are sections of the online left that say this should be normal politics, I don't think people should extrajudicially kill each other, basically. But yeah, I can see why people trolled when it came to Luigi, but no
Not
mainstream
in favour
party
of
did.
extrajudicial killings. Michael,
No.
you're so trad. So trad.
Let's wrap up there. Ash, it's been a pleasure being joined by you this evening.
Oh no, thank you so much for having me. And you know what? I really had the hump before I came on. Not the hump. I had the ump before I came on. I was very grumpy and I was feeling worn out, but I feel restored after an hour of talking through the stories with you.
You've been energized by Novara Live, as I hope our audience have been. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll be back tomorrow at 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.